Alrighty, let's get right into it. I am Marko Morrison, and today I want to talk about cyber deception and creativity and aggression inside of it. So, really quickly, who am I? I'm a UW-Bothell undergraduate student. I'm the president of the cybersecurity club there. I'm the CCDC team captain. I'm going to be doing pen testing at Security Innovation this summer for web apps, IoT, you name it. And I'm going to be speaking at RSA on the same topic. So if you're going to be there, then say hi. And before we get into it, I just want to say that these are the sources that I pretty much base the presentation off of. I found them to be fantastic. The fourth one down is a book, Deception, Counter-Deception, and Counterintelligence. Absolutely fantastic. I actually didn't end up reading the John Strand book for this research, so I will absolutely do that right after. But these are fantastic resources, and I'll be referencing them a lot. And Active Defense and Cyber Deception, that's an amazing course. So for those of you that haven't taken it, it's with Anti-Siphon Training. So please, if this is an interesting topic, make sure to do that. So before we talk about cyber deception, we have to talk about deception. And what is it, right? In the works that I've read, it has been described as a process intended to advantageously impose the false on a target's perception of reality. I really like this definition because it indicates really three big parts: that deception needs a target, it's used to create an advantage, and it relies on the false. You have to falsify information in order to deceive. And that's very, high level, but when we talk about cyber deception, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Turns out there's actually not a single definition for what cyber deception is, so I'm going to take my best stab at it and say that it's the practice of deliberately fabricating the false with the intent of introducing uncertainty, risk, difficulty, or frustration to an opponent's cyber operations. And this will become more apparent later. If you've taken the Active Defense and Cyber Deception course by John Strand, you'll know that frustration is a big part of it. Difficulty, risk is a big part of it. Enforcing choices onto the attacker is a big part. So we'll demonstrate that in a little bit. Something that I want to say first is that this is an alternative style of defense. Typically, when you think of a defense, you might think of, vulnerabilities. You might think of risk management. You might think of something more static, like a firewall or like an EDR, for example, something like that. This is going to be playing more on the assumptions that an attacker is going to make and the human actions that they're going to take, rather than something more technological or more static, I guess I should say. And then the other thing is that this, frequently relies on tricking an attacker into doing something against their best interest. That's kind of the definition wrapped up nicely. And when you think that, you might think a honeypot. This little graphic here really demonstrates it well, and I love stealing this one because it does such a good job. A honeypot pretty much is just a notion. It's not really fake because it's a real service, but it pretends to be another service, which in this case could be like a database or something. And let's get right into a demo. So the honeypot that we just mentioned, I can pull this up right here. A honeypot will act like one service, but when it's interacted with, it will have some adverse effect. The honeypot that I'm going to be using is called the MySQL honeypot by sjinx on GitHub, and I'm going to drop the Git link I'm going to drop the Git link if anybody is interested in following along. Okay, I guess it just wants to upload as an image. If you search up MySQL honeypot, it'll be there. But let's see. We're in desktop, and make sure you have Git installed first off. This is a completely fresh install of Ubuntu and Kali, minus a few dependencies that I did earlier because I tried the demo. Next, we are going to be cloning it. And I really want to, I guess I should say, I really want to go through the whole process because I want to demonstrate how fast and easy it can be. And I'll talk about that right after. So we need to clone it, go into the directory, and everybody can see this all right?
Yep.
Okay. So this particular one has a couple of dependencies. The first one is going to be GCC, which you should already have, but I didn't, so. And I updated right before this, but make sure you do sudo apt update, sudo, update and upgrade in whichever way your Linux distribution wants you to do. And then the next one is going to be libev, which is going to be at libev-dev. Oh. Finally, you're going to need make. Alrighty. So now that we're in the MySQL honeypot directory, now we can make it. It's going to output it right in the same directory, and from here, you can run it. All right, and that's all it took, right? It took like, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, something around there. And let me just get the IP address of this, which is 71.136. So at this point, this MySQL honeypot service is running. And if I were to, for example, nmap it, like I'm an attacker from a different virtual machine, 2.168.71.136. Oh, excuse me. Well, that's not supposed to happen. The demo gods are not kind tonight. Maybe I need to sudo it or something.
Let me sacrifice this chicken for you real quick. Hold on.
Hi. Yeah, no dice. I need to make sure that this is the right one. Yeah. Those are on the same network. All right. Let me. Sorry about that. Let me fiddle around with this a bit.
So I just wanted to add some commentary real quick. So this is what it feels like to be a sales engineer. So if any of you are interested in demoing live, this happens all the time in the sales engineering space.
Okay, they should be reconnecting any second now. I'm just gonna plop them right down on my home network instead. 114. Okay. And no dice. Well, that's all right because I actually do not have a video of this, but you're gonna take my word for it that if you nmap it, it's going to show up as MySQL. On port 3306, you can really designate any port you want from the honeypot, but point is, it's going to respond with the same signature as a MySQL database. So you might be asking yourself, why is this valuable? Well, if you're not expecting any user interaction with it or any legitimate user interaction with it, you can assume that any user interaction at all is highly suspicious. Think about how this might be useful. Maybe, let's say, we have this exact scenario, right? Maybe someone is nmapping this computer that has the honeypot on it, and hopefully nobody's ARP scanning or nmapping your computer, especially not if it's on like a marketing network or on some expectedly benign network that wouldn't have very many suspicious tools active on it. You can see if there's single host scans like nmap. You can see if there's login attempts. With this MySQL honeypot, you can actually, it works with the MySQL protocol, which means that it can receive passwords or not. And no matter what, it's not going to allow you to log in. The honeypot isn't going to allow you to log into it because it's not actually SQL, right? It's just a service that responds to SQL communications. But from that, you can get the IP address, you can get the login information of the login attempt, you can get the time that it was performed at. I think you can get the client agent. I'm not exactly sure. And you can get any associated, again, usernames is the really big thing, right? Mohammed isn't going to be trying to log into this random SQL database at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, right? It doesn't really make sense. And the thing is, because you're supposed to run this on a completely isolated, or not isolated, but a computer with no other purpose, if the honeypot itself is exploited, ideally there's nothing else valuable on it, so you're not really losing a lot, and you can easily just shut down the computer or VM or whatever you have it running on, Docker container, something like that. I believe there was a Docker file for this one. So probably don't domain join this one, Mimikatz. Bad. Okay, this one I'm like 90% sure works. So this is going to be another fast demonstration. Let's just get out of that disgraceful directory. Okay, so for this one we need git. For this one we also need g++. Should already have GCC, that's right. All right, this tool is called port spoof. And what port spoof does, I need to, excuse me for 1 second, I need to get the real directory. There you go. It's in the meeting text channel for those that want to follow along. But what port spoof does is it also is centered mostly around nmap or other scanners. And what it'll do is for every request that is made to the port that it's running on or to any port that it's running on, it's going to return a random service signature, right? When you try and log into, or you try and, nmap a MySQL database, it's going to return a MySQL signature. When you try and, nmap a HTTP server or like an Apache server, it's going to return HTTP signature. Port spoof lets you fake those, and it randomizes them as well. So it makes it very, very confusing for any attackers. So we need to git clone that, go into the directory. We need to use the configure file. All right, and that gives us our make file. From there, we can do the same thing as before, sudo make. Seems like everything was outputted into src, the source directory. And there it is. There's our port spoof binary. So again, you can see how fast and easy that was, right? So if we try and nmap the same machine. Okay, well, we know that it works now. Need to get rid of some of these IP tables rules. But if we start scanning it, we can actually see that a bunch of these ports have seemingly legitimate services on them. Port spoof specifically uses commonly used ports and matches them to that port. So for example, you can see 80 is HTTP. 22 is SSH. 21 is FTP. So on and so forth. 28 is FTP data. And you can go down the list and see that pretty much all of them are matching up, which makes sense, right? You wouldn't want to be running some, or it would be kind of out of the ordinary to see some random service on 22 or 80 or something. Any questions on port spoof real fast?
Yeah, I got a good question. Yeah, when would you say you would recommend when would you use port spoof? Like, would you say, like, let's put it across on all of our servers or all of our workstations, or just only for like certain honeypot type systems? Do you have any context on that?
Yeah, and that actually goes right into my next slide, so good question.
Sweet.
So the reason that this is valuable is because it really increases the ambiguity of an attack, specifically against a server, just like you were saying. I would personally really recommend using this for a server. It not only does it make it difficult for humans to understand what's going on, but it also makes it difficult for automated tools to go through this gigantic amount of data. I believe that if you have all 65,000 ports, 65,000-ish, if you have all of them responding with port spoof, I believe a full Nmap scan takes about 4 days or so to complete. Very long time. It's going to take time and resources. And the interesting thing is that if you are running port spoof along with some other kind of logging, you can actually be generating alerts from all of this. So if you have a continued scan going against this one server for 4 days straight, certainly that's enough time to catch something. What I would personally recommend doing is, let's say you have a stock server, let's say it's a web server running on port 80 and 443. What you could do is, you know what, let's say it's a MySQL database. Just because you're not going to have random people trying to access it on that port. Let's say you want to administrate it from another computer. Now, you could change that. Why did I mean to do that? You could change the port that the MySQL database is running on from 3306 to, I don't know, let's say 12,007, right? Now, if you have port spoof running and responding to queries on every single port except that, and you're using a non-standard port for your database, and everybody in your company that's supposed to know or supposed to be able to access the database, if they all know which port it's supposed to be used on or accessed on, it's going to make it very, very difficult for a random attacker to be able to even find which port your database is on, let alone try and get into it or try and, it's just going to make an attack that much harder. And these are not really services running on each port. It's just port spoof responding to signatures on each port. But if you try and run some other honeypots on a machine, so let's say you had that MySQL honeypot that we were talking about earlier, and you had maybe something like that, and you had an SSH honeypot as well, and you put those on random ports as well, then that's a nice little concoction that's going to make an attack very, very difficult and very, very ambiguous. I hope that answers your question. I think my honest opinion, I think that it's not really as useful for a client because that's not the target of an attacker. An attacker isn't necessarily going to be trying to pivot from client. Well, I don't know. I guess it depends. That's the cop-out answer. But let's talk about some other cool tools really fast. Cowrie is a fantastic tool. It's an SSH honeypot, and while other SSH honeypots would just let you try and log into them, Cowrie actually emulates a file system within it for the attacker to interact with. There's some predefined credentials that you can log in with, and you can actually set those yourself in the Cowrie config file. And if an attacker would try to make a successful login and they succeed, you can pretty much see every single command that they're going to be running. You can see what they would be doing, what tools they would be using if they're trying to exploit a vulnerability. What vulnerability would it be? And it keeps it pretty much completely segregated. I believe you can also run Cowrie from Docker. OS Chameleon is one that has not been updated or supported recently, which is a little bit sad, because what OS Chameleon does, again, based around Nmap or scanners or whatnot, but it lets you change the way that your computer responds to its own operating system signature, right? There's changes the way that your computer responds to everything, I guess. So that lets you disguise your Linux computer as a Windows one, or as a Mac even, or a whole number of other things. Artillery is a tool that combines a honeypot, it combines file monitoring, and it combines IP blocking. I personally really like this tool because it's very useful for CCDC, because you can combine a lot of the functionality into one tool, and it's just one download, one run, very easy. Kind of useful if you want to put out the fire, so to speak. And I guess it is very, highly useful for CCDC, but if you have some more time on your hands, I'd recommend using other tools. Canary tokens, if you've heard of cyber deception at all, you've probably heard of canary tokens. I actually do want to bring this one up because I think it's very useful. This is the website. It's canarytokens.org/generate. You can select any quote-unquote token. And in the context of cyber deception, tokens are, I guess, artifacts or objects or something that have an adverse effect when they're used. Typically, that's going to be something that's of expected value. So, for example, a Word document, an Excel document, whenever you open those, you're going to get an alert on your email or on a webhook or whatever you want. Microsoft SQL Server, there can be I think there's a DNS. So whenever someone tries to request a website on your network, unique email address, if someone tries to send spam emails to you or do a phishing attack against you. There's really just such a massive variety of options, and I would highly, highly recommend using Canary tokens. This is, again, completely free. All these things I should say are free. But Canary tokens are free. I believe Canary tokens are also open source, so you can see exactly how they work. Just out of curiosity, does anybody happen to know how the Microsoft Word Canary tokens work? The way that they work, and they don't work with macros. The way that they work is that there's a single 1x1 pixel image somewhere in the document, right? It's not going to be expected, or it's not going to be even visible to the naked eye, but it's going to be there, and it's going to try and resolve to a URL that's owned by Canary. And that's how they get it, right? DNS is a very reliable tunnel, as has been seen in the past. Yeah, it's funny to see. Okay, Napster is definitely not running on that computer. All right, and the last one I want to talk about is Open Canary, and I just want to turn on my camera really fast for this one because I actually do use Open Canary, or I've experimented with it. Pretty much, it's just a honeypot. It's for multiple protocols. You can have an FTP honeypot with this. You can have a SSH. You can have a MySQL. You can have HTTP. Pretty much anything you want. The reason that this is very different from other honeypots that you might see around is because of how much support it gets from Thinkist, which is the company that's responsible for Canary tokens as well. Does anybody else want to share any really good deception tools that they've seen around?
I have a question. Have you looked at like Active Directory Canary tokens or any tools that are free or even paid for?
I have not. I believe that actually there are Canary. You might have just said this, but I'm pretty sure there is an Active Directory Canary token.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I was looking away because I'm doing a few different things right now. But nice. Yeah, so at least some of the things that my clients have mentioned is as far as like cyber deception goes is like the defense in depth piece, because like as far as like canary tokens work. Like first off, they have to get into your environment. So like from like a security standpoint, you want to have like multiple controls in place. So like if somebody is actively scanning like those ports, you would hopefully have like network firewall logs to see that. And if you implement canary tokens and somebody's doing network scanning and you're not seeing that in the network firewall logs, then there's a gap there. So that's what I think is interesting about like canary tokens. They could be helpful, but it's definitely like the part of a defense in depth strategy that you want to implement. Because I have a lot of clients who are like, oh, we want one solution that'll stop everything. Well, it's like there's not one. You have to have like that defense in depth piece. But yeah, I'll let you get back to your demo.
No, yeah, thank you. That was good. Let me just open this real quick one more time. And up until this point, if you've taken the John Strand course, this is probably sounding all very familiar. But what I really want to talk about today, and this was all kind of context, what I really want to talk about today is what is the intent behind cyber deception? You know, we had this definition of the practice of deliberately fabricating the false, blah, 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 blah. But what does that really mean? You know, why is this important to keep in mind? As was kind of hinted at, prevention is impossible. You know, you have to always assume that there's going to be someone in your environment, that they're always going to be poking around, trying to do privilege escalation or actions on objectives or gather more information, what have you. The mindset that is really important with cyber deception is that instead of making your network invulnerable, you need to make it very, 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 very difficult and annoying and frustrating and time consuming and resource intensive to attack, you know, and it needs to be difficult, even more difficult to replicate an attack, so that any attacker that's not highly, highly specifically motivated is going to be either caught or they're going to give up. And at that point, I think that that's an acceptable level of risk if someone has a personal vendetta against you and they have the resources and time to make this attack work. So the way that you need to frame this, or in the way that I have been, you know, framing this topic in my mind, is that it revolves completely around how do you make an attack ambiguous? How do you make it unclear? How do you make it, you know, how do you make it so information is not trustworthy? How do you introduce risk to an attacker? How do you make it so that they need to make a lot more decisions in a vulnerable state? So on and so forth. And we'll come back to that later. Is deception effective? And this is a question I've asked around a lot. I have asked what higher level executives I can. I have asked SOC analysts. I would say that it's kind of hard to tell. Everybody that I've asked doesn't really want to answer to a university student, which is a little bit silly. But I also understand that, you know, it's probably not a topic that companies want to be sharing, because whenever cyber deception, exactly like you're saying, Sponger, whenever cyber deception is useful, that means that some incident has already occurred or that there's already been some breach. And that's why I want to point to two, oh my goodness. I want to point to two very, very, very valuable papers. The first one is called the Tularosa study. And this is and the second one, I should say, pretty much just revolves around analyzing the Tularosa study. So what is this Tularosa study thing and why is it so important? Basically, the Tularosa study was a 2-day exam, or not 2-day exam, but 2-day test, where penetration testers, red teamers of varying levels of experience and skill were given networks to attack. Their success was measured on, okay, can they get credentials? Can they get valuable information? Can they, can they do red team things? Can they do things that an attacker would want to, right? And these aren't actually flags, but I'm going to refer to them as flags. These were split into 4 groups of an attacker, and each one attacked a network over these 2 days, as mentioned before. The 4 groups of attackers were let's see. Yeah. So there are 4 groups here, and I'm kind of wiggling around. Let's see. Right here. Can you guys see this laser pointer? So the first one was a group where in the network there were no decoys, so no I believe that canary tokens and honeypots were used. So there were no canary tokens or honeypots. and the attackers weren't told anything about it, right? So this is just like your normal red team engagement / pen test. The second group, there were no decoys, no honeypots or canary tokens, but they were told that deception was being used. The third group had deception actually present, so honeypots and canary tokens were employed in that network, and they were not told about it. And the fourth group, excuse me. The fourth group had decoys present, and they were told about the existence of these decoys. This test was used to test these four hypotheses, and one really important characteristic about this test was just how big it was. Let me see if I can pull this up. I believe there was somewhere in the ilk of 50 to 60 red teamers, of varying skill levels, but that was a very unprecedented amount. Oh no, there were 30 per group. Yeah, roughly 30 per group. So that's about 120 pen testers / red teamers. So this is a very, very large study. And here are the findings. Success was based on how many flags were achieved or obtained, yes, but it was also decided based on how the red teamer was feeling, how the pen tester was feeling at the end of the day, right? Primarily, if we take a look back here at the top of the paper, it's about defense, but it's also about the psychological effects, psychological cyber deception. So success was self-judged based on the attackers. So in the control group, there was about a 70% success rate. And in the group where there was deception being employed, but they were told about it, there was about a 60%. A little bit worse, but still pretty good. Where we start to go down is when the absent uninformed group does their test. So there was no cyber deception here, and the people were told that there was, and we still went 10% lower than the group where there was actually deception, but they were in the know. And finally, our lowest group, a little bit behind absent informed, but not very much, was the present and uninformed. This was actually about a half and half split between failure and success. Now, any questions so far?
Yeah, I actually have a few questions if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So essentially, can you quickly, briefly? I'm terrible at numbers. Can you briefly describe this? So essentially, what this graph is showing is that the ones that were not informed had a lower success rate, correct?
So there were two groups that were not informed about cyber deception, and then one of those groups had deception in their environment, and one of them did not.
Okay. So this graph basically shows that it is somewhat helpful to have some type of deception in the environment, is the conclusion of that study?
Yes, and there's a couple other conclusions as well. Something of note is that the rate of success for absent uninformed, so just like a normal attack, is a little bit better, 7% better, but it's not really much different than a attack where there is cyber deception, but the attackers know about it.
Okay.
That was the really key part for me, the takeaway for me at least, because I thought to myself, okay, well, when I see this graph, it kind of tells me that if the attacker knows what cyber deception is, and they know that a company is large enough or has a strong enough security posture to use it, and has, I guess the resources and ingenuity to use cyber deception, then it's probably going to be on this network, so I should probably be careful.
Okay. Yeah, because just based off my experience, I think deception is interesting because some people and companies that I've talked to, it's like, yeah, I mean, obviously John Strand says it can be helpful, and his classes are awesome. I've taken 2 of them from Anti-Siphon, and they're great. So if you have the time to do it, and your work will pay for it, do it. They're amazing. But I've had conversations where specifically at large organizations, deception can be very hard to implement because it can be extremely noisy and just tough to manage. Just if you have lots of infrastructure, how much deception from an account level, from SSH, from like servers do you want to manage? So unless you have like a really well built out team, it like it can be helpful. And I also like to think of like cyber deception as like it's essentially your landmines along the attack path. And specifically, like this came up in a discussion at my work where you don't have like a vulnerability problem, you have like an adversary problem. And there's nation state threat actors and there's e-criminals and cyber gangs, which operate at a much different tempo. Cyber gangs are going to be quick. They want to get in your environment. They want to like ransomware. They want to encrypt. They want to do it quickly before they can get caught. Whereas like nation state adversaries and nation state threat actors, they're very, very, very slow. They want to live in the environment. So if you do have cyber deception and they trip up on one of those landmines, you may be able to detect them because those nation state threat actors are usually leveraging like 0 days or custom command and control servers like Cobalt Strike with default configs. Like, and it depends how successful or how advanced they are. Where they could be in, they may not even be leveraging Cobalt Strike because most like antiviruses, some antiviruses can detect that type of activity, but they also leverage like fully customizable C2 tooling. So this is where like the defense in depth, like that slide that you mentioned earlier, comes in. Like, this is another control that you would possibly want to have in place to help in your defense in depth strategy, because there's no such thing as like a zero, like a non-vulnerable environment.
Very well said. Any other questions? All right. So that's like the first half of this presentation, and that was kind of just laying the groundwork for what I kind of knew going into doing research on cyber deception. But the thing is, there were some issues, and I want to talk about that and kind of dissect deception theory and practice. This is going to get a little bit more theoretical and a little bit less practical, but I think it'll be an interesting one regardless. So one thing I noticed when I was doing research is that people love to talk about cyber deception, right? It's a cool sounding idea, right? Oh, you're tricking the attacker. Oh, you're hacking back, but not really. People love, and I like this phrase a lot, they love to wring their hands about it and talk about how cool and good cyber deception is, right? I came across this post on LinkedIn when I was trying to look around, and listen to this sentence. Cyber deception offers a transformative approach enabling defenders to lead the adversary, gain intelligence on their methods, and secure critical assets. How cookie cutter, like threat intel feed could this statement be, right? This sounds like a vendor. I think that people are kind of not innovating enough and they're not using it enough to, they're just not. I don't know. There's nothing else to say on that. The second thing, and that's the one that I mentioned before, is that when deception is expected, it becomes pretty much, okay, there's a slight decrease in success, but it becomes largely way less effective, I guess. So making the same tool over and over again isn't going to work. And what I mean by that is that when I was doing research, I was a little bit depressed by the sheer number of identical tools. This is just one list of them. If you know the series of awesome lists, quote unquote, this is the awesome list for honeypots. And if you scroll down and you keep scrolling down, you will see very, very, very many duplicate honeypots. You will see very, very, very many duplicate techniques. Right? If I search up ICS, I get 20 results. If I do Control F for ICS, I get 20 results. If I do that for FTP, I get 6 results. There should not be 6. There's no need for 6 different FTPs or honeypots. If I do SSH, 51 results. I wonder, 8 for HTTP. Again, if an attacker has experience with this, it's going to become largely ineffective, is my second point. And here's the third question. What if a tool like this, like deception, or like honeypot, what if this deception is just not encountered, right? Yes, the example is that, okay, an attacker is trying to move very, very slowly, like a nation state actor is trying to move very, very slowly, and they trip this. But what if they don't, right? What if they don't? Then what, right? Dwell time is going down. as in the time that an attacker spends in an environment before doing their actions on their objective. So attackers are moving very fast. Even if they do trip it, they're still going to be moving very quickly. Like you're saying, those cyber gangs, they're moving very, very quickly towards their objective, right? So getting one more alert isn't really going to change anything. So the way that I kind of thought about this from this point on was saying, okay, something needs to, we need to start thinking differently about cyber deception. What is the new mindset that we need to have? What are some good examples, right? We saw, if I go way back, port spoof was a great example. Can you imagine trying to, even gather what's on a machine running port spoof with 65,000 services? Even just on MySQL honeypot, this isn't a really good example. Cowrie, for example. That's a great one, right? OS Chameleon is great. It lets you highly, highly increase the amount of ambiguity in an attack. My question was, how can we do this consistently? And what are some good historical examples of deception like this? So I kind of thought about it a little bit, and I said, oh, well, they use deception a lot in military, right? And for those of you military in the audience, please correct me if I'm a uni student, so you probably know more about it. But the DoD defines counterintelligence and psychological operations as this. And in the book, deception is described as a process intended to advantageously impose the false on a target's perception of reality. The reason I put these three down is because when we say cyber deception, we really mean cyber information operations, quote unquote. And these information operations are split up into these three branches: deception, counterintelligence, and psychological operations. You'll often see these performed by different actual branches within the military. But, in a company, in an organization of cybersecurity, it's probably just going to be one group. And these definitions don't really help us too much. So let's talk about what actually constitutes a really valuable deception or a strong deception. Every deception needs a truth, the real thing that you're trying to hide. It needs denial, the method in which you're hiding this truth. It needs deceit, like an alternate truth that or an alternate falsehood that you're presenting as truth, and misdirection, which is guiding the attacker towards this false truth and away from the real truth. I really want to emphasize the need for misdirection. This is the exact issue that we were talking about here, where, okay, what if deception simply isn't encountered? We need to find a way, or developers and defenders need to find a way to make tripping these traps unavoidable, right? It needs to be very enticing. It needs to be indistinguishable from real truths. And within a deception, there's two different kinds. A type, which is ambiguity increasing, and M type, which is misleading. If we go back here, they fit very, very well into these deception categories. MySQL honeypot, right? This is an example of misleading because you're presenting an alternate truth and saying, hey, here's the SQL honeypot or here's the MySQL database that you want, right? It's not this other one that's active on the network somewhere else. Port spoof is a fantastic example of ambiguity increasing. You're not actually faking any services, but you're making it incredibly, incredibly difficult to find a legitimate, valuable service, right? This is kind of like security by obscurity, which people say, which isn't a real form of security. But in this case, it actually is very valuable to have an obscured target. Yeah. And when we talk about misdirection, this is the really, 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 really important part of deception, because misdirection involves the entire decision process that an attacker goes through in order to reach your honeypot or reach the scenario that you want, that you have in mind. When you yourself are going through these decisions and modeling, what do you think an attacker would do? You're going through the opponent's OODA loop. An OODA loop is commonly used in military, but this is pretty much how decisions and thinking are modeled in a fast-paced scenario, in a important scenario. the first step is to observe. So you see something that is happening. I don't know why these arrows are going in this direction. That's not right. But you need to observe. Then you need to orient. So based on this observation, you determine what it means in context, right? For example, what's an example? Let's say I want to eat a burger, right? I put the burger on my plate and I stand up and I start walking. I see that there's nothing in my path, but suddenly it falls. The burger falls off my plate. I observe that. I orient what that means to me. It means I'm hungry, right? It means I'm not going to be able to eat the burger. But I also understand that if I pick it up, reasonably fast, I probably will be able to eat it. So the decision that I'm going to make is, okay, I'll pick it up in 3 seconds because, there's no germs on it then. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that. Then I'm going to observe the outcome of that scenario. If there's some crumbs on the burger or something, or, it doesn't really matter. But you keep on going through this loop. And you decide, and that's how decisions are made. That's how actions are taken, right? You can actually apply this to pretty much every aspect of your life. Now, what's important is that in a defensive structure, you're typically going to be performing your own OODA loop. If you're doing like incident response, you're going to be going through an OODA loop and seeing these events, unfold. You're going to be orienting them in terms of what's important to your client or to the company that you're protecting. You're going to be deciding what actions to take based on those observations and orientations, and you're going to be performing that. Rinse, repeat, right? But in order to have an attacker arrive at a scenario that you want, you actually want to go backwards through the OODA loop. They call this inverse OODA loop. So instead of, going observe, orient, decide, and act, you're going to be choosing the action that you want them to take in the very end, like, I don't know, click or trying to connect to my SSH or SQL honeypot. You're going to be focusing on the decision that leads to that. So at what point do they outweigh and say that this is more worth it than doing something else? You're going to be modeling how they orient themselves with information that they have previously observed in your environment. And orienting and deciding are the two big ones that are really difficult to model, but observation and action are a little bit easier. Any questions so far? Okay. This is just a little diagram that I drafted up, which helps defenders make tools that follow this model. So you start off with motivation or the motivation for creating this tool. What attacker behavior has been observed? This is the attacker action that we were talking about. How can these be exploited? How are you going to, based on this predictable action or assumption, how are you going to introduce something that might be, less favorable for the attacker if they take this action, right? Then you can create a general concept, but then you would decide, okay, based on these 3 branches that we talked about before, how is an attacker going to be deciding and orienting, or what information are they going to be using to decide and orient? Right. We can briefly take a look at these. I don't really want to read them out loud. But it really revolves around counterintelligence, deception, and psychological operations. And what I will say very quickly is that a lot of the time, tools are going to be falling under deception operations or counterintelligence operations, because this is either misleading someone into doing something against their best interests or for your best interest, or it's going to be denying information and actively, interfering with channels of information for attackers. So let's just run through this as an example, right? So as of 2023, 49% of breaches involve stolen credentials, right? We can know that, therefore, attackers are typically going to be trusting of stolen credentials, and also they're going to be trusting of the people that distribute those credentials. So here's our concept, right? Let's say that if an attacker exfiltrates from, let's say, a fake, a MySQL honeypot, and if that MySQL honeypot actually allowed the attacker to log in and it actually generated randomized credentials for the attacker to take, the attacker might treat those credentials as legitimate. Future attacks could be prevented if those junk credentials are distributed to other attackers who then come in, try and attack you with those fake credentials, and it doesn't work. Basic concept, right? But the thing is, there's a lot more to it than just this concept. We can just say, oh, okay, this is going to categorize under counterintelligence and deception. So we can go through and consider the information that an attacker will be ingesting in order to reach this conclusion or reach the decision to take this action. And once we go through that, we actually see that we get a lot more information from it. Right? What's important? What's really going to be the important qualities of this is not how, the attacker is deceived, but the details that make the attacker believe this deception is legitimate. Right? The junk credential thing is not really important, but what's really important is that this tool can respond to the MySQL networking protocol. Right? So any other client or any other attacker client or attacker tool will be compatible with it. Right? Counterintelligence. What are they going to be paying attention to? What information are they going to be ingesting? And how are they going to be doing that? And how can we interfere with it using these junk credentials? Right? This is just, the tool doesn't really matter, is my point. What matters is how you think about the attacker decision process. Here's a couple of takeaways that I have. The first one is to please use cyber deception in defense. Don't hack back, but use cyber deception, please. It's very, very valuable. As you saw, normally the MySQL honeypot will work. Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but it's very fast to do, very easy to set up. If you're a small organization and you are one of a few, or if it's just you in the cybersecurity department, I would highly, highly recommend. And even if not, bring it up. Start talking about it. Please don't use repetitive tools and strategies. If you just drop a ton of honeypots wherever and canary tokens wherever, sure, it might be, valuable, but a careful attacker will be able to see through it. Get creative, get aggressive, right? In the same vein. And be very deliberate with how you actually use and perform cyber information operations. The two that we mainly talked about today were counterintelligence and deception. But as like a little exercise, you can think, how would psychological operations work, right? Psychological operations, you can kind of think of it as changing public perception or perception of a group of your organization. Be deliberate with it, plan it out, have a strategy, model attacker decisions, especially for your own environment, for your own assets, and for your own organization. Any questions?
Yeah, I got a question. But first off, hey, well done. Thank you for all this information. I love the piece that you talked about. You're going to use honey tokens in CCDC. That makes me smile. So, to the question, what are your thoughts around, say, building a real system, like a real SQL Server machine, say in Azure or somewhere, and just putting all sorts of like, I don't know, like a Waza agent or some kind of detection agent on it, and verbose logging to detect, things either on the internet or within your internal environment, where if anybody gets into those machines, you're like, no, that should not be happening at all. That's definitely bad actions. What are your thoughts versus going like you mentioned? There's all these honeypots out there that are like very much honeypots versus a real machine on the network.
Right. I mean, deception isn't dependent on the tool. So I'd say that you're absolutely right that it is valuable. If you just have some unused box and you set up some condition that should never happen in, proper operations, I guess. So to your point, yeah, I think that's a very, very, very valid way to perform not even really deception. That's more like a landmine, right? Exactly like Sponger was talking about. I don't know. I think that's a good idea.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, I should say that, cyber deception is really not dependent on tools. You don't need to use a honeypot. You don't need to use some other kind of fancy schmancy tool or anything. It really depends on the strategy that you use in the context of your organization and your environment. And again, I know that's a cop-out answer, but just being smart about how you, again, being creative, right? Being creative is half of being creative and aggressive. So absolutely, use whatever tools you can, right? Home Alone.
Real quick, and this is probably just a me and you, Marko thing. Back when we were in the old lab, we could have probably just plugged in our whole environment into the port where it was connected to the internet, and we could have caught so many things. So just for everybody else's knowledge, so I help out the cybersecurity club at Bothell, and they had a lab. The ports were actually, if you plugged in, you get public internet. So we made it so that we had our own private internet, but we could have easily just made it plug right into the public internet, and anybody could have gotten into our systems. And if we would have well designed them to fortify against, the rest of the environment, like at UW, we could have tested some of that out, but that seems a little risky and a lot of work. But anyways, awesome. Thanks, Marko. This is great.
Yeah, thank you.
Marko, I got a quick question.
Yes.
Is there, I know you mentioned like the awesome lists, like awesome honeypots and things like that. Have you found any sort of frameworks that exist that that kind of like an all-in-one tool that is kind of designed, maybe like open source, that can be used for deploying out deception strategies across multiple systems? I know like Thinkus Canary, or yeah, I think it's Thinkus. They have like the Canary tokens and their whole suite that they sell. It's a commercial product, but I was curious if you found anything that's more like open to the rest of us.
Yeah, I would say the best bet for that would probably be the Open Canary tools. I'll just drop the link real quick. Open Canary, that's the thing that I was bringing up earlier, where it's okay, it can be an FTP, it can be really anything. The point is that it's a machine that's specifically designed to be a honeypot. So it could be, you could have any arbitrary service running on it. But I guess also to Jesse's point, you could just use any computer, and a lot of these tools have, you can run them in Docker, right? Or you can, run it in a virtual machine or something. It doesn't necessarily need to be specifically a tool to run the honeypot service or the deception service. It just needs to be running somewhere, or there needs to be some norm that is violated if unusual behavior happens. But I would say if you're looking for a specific tool, probably Open Canary is the best way to go. Again, you can run it on like a Raspberry Pi, and this one was owned by the lab, so yeah.
Okay, appreciate it. And you said most of this research is more kind of just research that you've been doing. Have you? I know you mentioned you had kind of a hard time working with people from an industry giving you certain feedback.
Yeah.
Is that something you're still working on trying to find like contacts on?
Yeah, I want to hear success stories and failure stories of deception. I actually talked to there was one person, Casey Smith, that Jesse set me up with from Thinks Canary. I wanted to talk to him about any success stories that they've had. And I say, okay, what are some examples of, your tool working as appropriate, right? And Casey can't really say anything, right? Or doesn't want to say anything. And it kind of makes sense because as a representative of different clients that have presumably had data breaches, which is how we know that these things are successful, it's a very touchy subject to share, or not touchy, but a very sensitive subject to share. So yes, I am definitely still looking for people to talk to about that, specifically people that are willing to share about stories of usage and how is deception, is it really effective in the wild, right? Not just in a sanitized study, but if they deployed it, and if they deployed something common like a canary token or a honeypot, did it work? Did it not work? Why? How? All the details.
Okay. Yeah. Reach out to me after this. I'd like to see if I can maybe get in contact with some individuals.
Yeah,
Sweet.
I have some comments on that, but definitely want to make them after we stop recording.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, same.
So let me know, Sean, when we stop the recording.
Yeah, yeah, we could wrap things up right now. Is this the? I guess this is the end of your slides.
Yes. For those of you that are watching the recording, if you want to share any information, please reach out to me on social media. My name is Marko Morrison. And thank you to Null 404 for having me. Thank you to everybody for listening. And yeah, have a good day.